In this world of technology, things are ever changing, rearranging. You need someone to help you out. I know someone who can. You'll never be alone. You'll be with Paul Amadeus Lane in the Techzone.
Third and final segment of the show. Paul Amadeus Lane, ABC News Radio, KMET. Thank you so much for tuning in, streaming all the different formats that we have. Thank you so much for your support. Computer hacking. I remember, must have been 13, 14. I'm telling my age right now. Pops took me to go see War Games. I remember War Games. It starred Matthew Broderick. And if you don't remember War Games, the title, maybe you remember this. Shall we play a game? How about global thermonuclear war? Remember that, Joshua, and all that other stuff. You know, the saddest part of that that movie for me was when the FBI saw Matthew Lightman, who was played by Matthew Broderick. I think that was his name. David Lightman, that was his name. At 7-Eleven, they surrounded him. They grabbed his big gulp, took it and threw it to the ground. I remember I took a good friend of mine, like a relative of mine. I said, hey, this is going to be the saddest part of the movie right here. That just touched me, man. Why they had to take his big gulp like that and throw it to the ground? That's blasphemous. Yes, it was. But that movie really talked about what can happen with hacking. My next guest wrote a book in the 80s about hacking. And what's interesting is that the things that he wrote about, we still see today with cybercrimes. And so let's check in with him, ask him about the book, and just some of the parallels that we see almost 40 years later. And I'm so excited to have with me right now, author of the Trapdoor, Hal Glatzer. Hal, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Paul. Good morning.
Good morning, my friend. Great to have you in. And Hal, when I look back at your book that you wrote many decades ago, you were really transformational in your thinking and looking at where we're at today and taking us back to the beginning of that project. What led you to write that novel in the first place?
Well, I had been covering the rise of computers. I bought my first computer in 1980, mainly to use as a word processor. And it so dramatically increased my productivity that I realized that could be a beat for me as a reporter and editor. So I started interviewing people I knew who had started to use microcomputers. And that led me on a path of covering high technology for a living. And then I started interviewing people. I went to some of the early computer trade shows, the West Coast Computer Fair, Comdex, places like that. And I met all kinds of people. I met some hackers, and I met more DP and MIS managers whose systems had been hacked. And I thought, whoa, there's a story in this. And so I decided to write a novel with a computer hacker as my protagonist.
And when we look at just the character in the novel, Joe the Lightning, now how realistic was that for that time in the 80s?
Okay, well, he's a composite, obviously. There's no one person on whom this could be based. But there were an awful lot of hacks, and there was an awful lot of technology that had started to spill out from the commercial and the military sectors. There was not yet an internet, so everything had to be dialed up directly. You plugged the headset of a phone into a modem, and you made your dial at 300 bits per second. It just seems trivially slow today. Your floppy disks, 5.25-inch floppy disks, held 128 kilobytes of data, and this was a big breakthrough. what Joe could do was doable, but not necessarily by any one individual. I worked in a lot of stuff that was possible, it was theoretically possible, or was actually being done, and I made a bit of a hash of them together in order to further the story. But I would say that enough of what you read was doable, just not by any one particular individual at any one time.
And how, when we look at just hacking in general, and looking at when you first created this novel, you kind of gave us a glimpse into hackers. Why do hackers hack? And what you thought back then, has it changed over the decades, or is it kind of the same?
That's a good question. 40 years ago, 35, 40 years ago, hackers were lone individuals. I created Joe to some extent out of the loners and the nerds that I went to school with, who had their shirt pockets full of pens in a plastic pen protector, and who lived very solitary lives. They didn't have many tight, close human attachments. I modeled Joe somewhat realistically on some of the boys my own age, or roughly, who I had grown up with. Nowadays, of course, hacking is business. You have some truly awful hackers in the world. We're not talking about petty theft of stealing $100 out of a brokerage account in another city. You're talking about ransomware. I'm going to corrupt your computer, and you've got to pay me thousands of dollars to get your data back. We're not talking about, in those days, there was no state or government that was behind any of this. Now it's famous. You have international hacking done at the behest of government, paid for by government agencies. The people they employ to do this are maybe to some extent still young men with no big social lives. But it's become a huge enterprise. The hacking of the Democratic National Convention emails 4 years ago, the rise of ransomware, these sorts of things are so utterly different and orders of magnitude more dangerous than somebody like Joe 40 years ago that was stealing $100 here, getting himself an extra computer there. Those were petty crimes by comparison. It's Joe's bad luck to come under the influence of someone that wants to use his talent for a bigger hack than Joe himself could have imagined.
And you bring up some very good points, Hal, that's, have all kind of nostalgia ringing through my head right now. My dad has always been in the tech world. He'll be 86 next month, but he worked for like NCR, AT&T, and all the different tech companies when I was growing up. And I remember we would hear on the news about different hacks happening, like in the 80s. And my dad said what they would do, like when the authorities got them and getting ready to prosecute them, these businesses would come in and say, look, let's drop the charges. I want to bring you in to work for my company so you can stop other people from hacking. Now, was that true, or was my dad giving me a lot of who shot John?
No, I think a lot of that was true. I think there was a great deal of embarrassment. If you were the data processing manager or the management information systems manager for a large corporation, a corporation listed on Wall Street, you really did not want anybody to know that your system was vulnerable to being hacked, even by, and especially perhaps by, an amateur working alone in a little room somewhere. You had industrial espionage, but you always assumed that it came from your biggest competitors or from a company in another country that was trying to steal your particular corporate secrets. And so offering the hacker a chance to work in computer security was a good way to co-opt the threat. Now, what I did, of course, in my novel is I turned that into a hack itself, that if somebody were truly unscrupulous and was busted for hacking, or in this case, was assumed to have been busted for hacking, he could use his new job as a security consultant to hack. He would know the inside dimensions of other people's computers who had hired him to track their security apparatus, and then he would be able to do even more subtle and more dangerous things. So that's
wow. I'm like blown away just by you sharing that with us, how and just how things were back in the 80s to where we're at today. And before we talk about the comparisons again about what we see in the 80s to what we see now, when it came to the term the trapdoor again, let's delve in a little bit in the novel. You talked about the trapdoor, and how does that work again? That the hacker is able to steal?
Well, a trapdoor is one of two popular hacks in those days. And I would say that they probably still exist in some form. A trapdoor is basically just what you think of. The hacker gets into a system. He finds a weak point. He inserts code or a routine into the program that he's penetrated, and that causes something to happen. Let's say, for the sake of argument, you want to get $1,000 out of this company. So you say, okay, you introduce a piece of code that says, okay, on December 31st at 11 o'clock a.m., cause a check to be written to this and such a bank account. And then when that's done, remove all the traces of this event from the records, from the data that's been stored. That's a trapdoor. The other approach, which is something that Joe prefers, Joe doesn't like trapdoors, actually. He finds himself forced to create one late in the book. But Joe's preferred method is what was then called slicing the salami, where you actually get in and do your theft in real time. You get in, you cut the check, and you get and you've trimmed the fund that you've hacked a little bit at a time so that nobody notices. A trapdoor tends to be a much bigger theft, but it happens by remote control. You're not really in the system at the time, and if the hacker is skilled and lucky, he doesn't get busted for it.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that explanation. That, it really just makes sense and resonates with not only what happened back in the 80s, but also now. And how have hackers changed since the 80s until now? I know we kind of touched on it just a little bit, but what are some other things that you have seen now that you thought maybe wasn't possible back then?
Well, certainly the ability to essentially call up anybody's computer has changed with the role of the internet and the international telecommunications. But what's changed to some extent is that if you're a hacker, if you're working for a government and you're trying to undermine something in another country, it's really hard to actually break in. What you find now is that people whose systems have been hacked almost always have opened the door themselves accidentally and certainly without intent. 4 years ago, the hack of the DNC's emails happened because somebody opened an attachment. And since you may very well ask me this question later, what can you do to prevent your system from being hacked? I can't really speak to the technical ins and outs, but the best advice is don't open any unsolicited attachment. Whenever you see an email or you get a message on Facebook that shows a URL and somebody whose name you recognize is saying something like, I'm sending you this because I'm sure you'll enjoy it. You have to really stop and say, wait a minute. I know this fellow, but what is he sending me? Why would I want to open this? A real friend will say, here's a link to the video I shot from our trip to the Grand Canyon last summer. Then you know this is either real or it's not real. But if you, at the very least, question the sender who sent you this thing, says, all it says is, I think you'll like this. If you must, reply and say, what exactly have you sent me? Then, if it's really your friend, he'll come back and say, it's video I shot from our trip to the Grand Canyon last summer. But if it's really a hacker, particularly somebody that's on a fishing expedition, they won't respond. Or they'll respond with the same generic, it's just something I'm sure you'll like, or something like that. So the biggest change in hacking that I see is that now it's almost impossible to break into a system unless somebody accidentally lets you in by clicking on something they shouldn't click on, which then enters your computer and opens it up to the person who created the hack.
For those wise words, Hal. I mean, that really resonates, especially during this time with a lot of cyberbullying and everything. So really appreciate you sharing that with us. And how can one find out more information about you, about this wonderful book? You want to give some information out there?
Sure. HalGlatzer.com, HalGlatzer.com is my website. Trapdoor is available through my website with a PayPal connection. It's also on Amazon in the Kindle store. And there's a lot of stuff about my other mysteries and novels on my website. And there's also, as you might expect, a whole section of music with some video and YouTube clips of some of the music I've been making over the years. HalGlatzer.com.
Awesome. Hal, thank you so much for joining me here on the Techzone. Really appreciate all your insight and also looking in deeper why you created this novel in the first place. Really enjoyed our chat, Hal.
Thank you, Paul. I've enjoyed talking to you too.
Great chatting with Hal Glatzer. Wow. Thinking back to the book he wrote almost 40 years ago and what we see today, truly ahead of his time. And the fact that it's re-released now on Amazon in digital format. Yeah. Great read. Definitely check it out. Well, thank you for tuning into the show. If you missed our big announcement in the first segment of the show about a new show that I'll be doing, you have to rewind or you have to start from to get it. I'm not going to tell you. But thank you so much for tuning into the show. Looking forward to chatting with you next time. Take care. Love you all to life. Talk to you soon.